Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. The woman on the line to 911 wasn't screaming. Her voice was flat, shaky, but deliberate. "He's not breathing," she said. "I ran him over. I think he's dying." May 28th, 2024. Las Vegas Metro Police Department received a dispatch call just after 5:37 a.m. First responders arrived on the 6100 block of Stonewall Avenue, a suburban cul-de-sac on the west side of town. It was a calm morning, too calm, one officer noted, until they saw the man crumpled against the wall. Richard Pinardo Jr., 51 years old, was found unconscious with blunt force trauma to the skull and upper thoracic spine. His white t-shirt was stained dark and heavy. He was non-responsive and gasping, but alive. A charcoal gray SUV was parked a few feet away, with its front grille cracked inward and minor traces of red fibers embedded along the lower bumper. The woman who placed the call, later identified as 31-year-old Julie Bush, was sitting on the sidewalk, legs folded under her, hands resting on her knees. She did not resist. She did not run. The paramedics rushed Pinardo to University Medical Center trauma. His pulse was erratic. Breathing was shallow. A CT scan revealed cranial swelling and internal bleeding. Trauma surgeons would later report that his brain activity declined rapidly by 6:10 a.m. He was pronounced dead at 8:43 a.m. the next day. At the scene, Bush was transported without incident to Metro's Northwest substation for initial questioning. No weapons were recovered. No drugs found on site. There were no third-party witnesses present during the impact. Only a single stationary camera facing a neighboring driveway, and a woman whose tone on the call had triggered more confusion than alarm. Here's what we confirmed that morning. The vehicle was registered to Julie Bush, the man her longtime partner. They shared a 5-year-old child. According to DMV data, there were no prior violations attached to the vehicle, no open restraining orders. The neighborhood had no prior domestic disturbance reports filed under either name within the last year. And yet, something about the positioning of the body, the angle of impact, the lack of skid marks, and the full weight of the vehicle directed squarely into the point of contact, raised immediate forensic questions. Officer Hale, first on the scene, would later write in his report, "Victim's body showed signs of compression between vehicle and wall, no drag marks, no lateral bruising, no evasive action indicated." At the station, Julie Bush was coherent, if visibly unsteady. Her pupils were constricted, her voice again flat. She stated the following: "He was yelling, I saw the trash, I lost it." The word trash would seem irrelevant in the moment, but investigators noted it anyway, because in homicide cases, irrelevant words usually aren't. In early case logs, this incident was listed under vehicular assault with possible domestic undercurrent. But as more data came in, and as Pinardo's condition worsened, it shifted. The question was no longer whether an assault occurred. It was why, and whether the damage had been spontaneous or calculated. Detective Mark Caldwell, assigned lead investigator, reviewed initial evidence by noon. Vehicle impact analysis, residential surveillance footage, Julie's talk screen, her verbal statement, her digital footprint. He noted, "The alignment is too perfect. Clean trajectory, no panic in voice. Data consistency this tight can either mean mechanical precision or emotional shutdown. Neither is easy to prosecute, but one of them is always lethal." The forensic technician's early photos showed very little lateral deflection on the vehicle's hood. No bent license plate, no streaking. The vehicle had not grazed the wall. It had pushed Pinardo into it. At 3:15 p.m., an officer canvassing the trash bins outside the home made the first forensic discovery that would become central to the case. A single tampon wrapper, not in the bathroom trash, but in the kitchen garbage, still unused, partially unrolled next to the coffee grounds and orange peels. To most people, that would have meant nothing. But paired with Julie's fragmented statement, it started to suggest motive. Julie's phone was recovered inside the vehicle, unlocked. Messages from the night before showed no indication of immediate conflict, no threat, no argument. But she hadn't slept, according to smartwatch logs, and her screen time was elevated. 4 hours active use between midnight and 5:20 a.m. The final app accessed? Google. Search term, How to tell if your partner is cheating on you. These weren't damning pieces of evidence, but they weren't benign either. Investigators flagged the device for full digital forensic extraction. In parallel, the medical examiner was preparing for autopsy protocol on Pinardo, scheduled for the following morning. For now, the facts were limited. One victim, one vehicle, one potential motive, implied by a cryptic phrase and a strange item in the trash. But cases don't rely on drama. They rely on patterns. And this one, from the start, was trying too hard to look accidental. As Caldwell put it later that week, the problem wasn't that we didn't have enough information. The problem was that we had it all too soon. And when you have everything at once, something's usually hiding behind it. By the time the autopsy was scheduled, a secondary team had already begun combing through both Richard Pinardo Jr.'s and Julie Bush's personal histories. This wasn't standard background vetting, it was targeted. Something about the scene, the clean strike, the lack of panic, the intact timeline, made it necessary to look backward before going forward. Richard Pinardo Jr. was born in April 1973 in California. His criminal record, though not public-facing in recent years, was extensive and traceable through state and federal systems. Between 1999 and 2013, he was arrested on multiple charges including conspiracy to commit murder, weapons trafficking, and fraud. Most of the heavier counts stemmed from a 2002 indictment tied to a failed insurance scam that investigators at the time claimed was nearly homicidal in design. He served time in Nevada and was released in 2017 under supervised reentry. Despite the past, by 2019 he had relocated to Las Vegas and registered a business license for an appliance repair venture under his name. There were no major financial red flags in the last 3 years. Credit score clean, no recent civil suits. Police were not called to his address during that period for domestic complaints. On paper, he had stabilized. But law enforcement doesn't rely on paperwork alone. A canvass of neighbors on Stonewall Avenue produced mixed impressions. One neighbor, who asked not to be named, said Richard kept to himself, mostly worked on cars in the garage, and described him as polite but intense. Another said they heard shouting, maybe once a month, from inside the home, usually followed by silence. One resident reported seeing broken glass in the driveway 2 months prior and a heated argument around midnight in March. No calls were made at the time. Julie Bush's background painted a different kind of profile. No criminal record, no known drug charges, but her digital footprint was inconsistent. Her primary occupation was listed as home-based childcare provider, though the license under her name had lapsed in 2023. Social media activity dropped significantly after 2022, and her bank account, subpoenaed by investigators that week, showed erratic withdrawals and purchases, including a $500 ATM pull 3 days before the incident. Phone records suggested increasing late-night activity in the weeks leading up to the crime. Texts to Richard showed mild confrontations. "You're pulling away again. Don't make me feel like the other women meant more. I swear you're hiding something." The last message from her to him before the incident, time-stamped 3:21 a.m. on May 28th, simply read, "So it was true." Investigators flagged that message. It appeared without context. No previous reply from Richard, no follow-up from Julie. Just a flat, loaded sentence. Search history from Julie's Google account between May 24-28 contained the following queries. How to know if someone's lying to you. How to tell if your partner cheated. How hard do you have to hit someone with a car to kill them? Cleared from browser but recovered from cache. This discovery was not disclosed to the public at the time, but it would later become a crucial element in the pretrial filings. Inside the home, a secondary forensic team completed a site survey. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, but several items were logged. A broken phone charging cable, strands of hair caught in the glove compartment of the SUV, and a pair of sunglasses with a cracked lens found near the outdoor trash bins. All 3 would be examined for DNA and prints. The home's kitchen garbage was sealed and submitted for lab processing. Itemized, logged, and labeled Trash Bag A. What investigators were looking for wasn't proof of intent. Not yet. They were mapping behavioral escalation. Detectives reviewing Julie's past interviews during a separate child services evaluation in 2021 noted a quote, "When I feel cornered, I don't know how to shut it down. It builds in me. That quote didn't prove anything, but in conjunction with the psychological profile building in parallel to the physical evidence, it offered context. And context, in domestic fatalities, is what prosecutors lean on when the evidence is clean, but the motive is clouded. Julie was still in custody, not yet charged with homicide. As of May 30th, her preliminary hearing had not been set. She had asked for a public defender. Bail was denied based on probable cause and risk of flight. She made no statements to the press, no contact with family, no request for her child to visit. Detective Caldwell reviewed the latest updates that evening. His notes were methodical. One line stood out. They fought in silence, the kind that doesn't leave bruises until it's too late. In towns like Las Vegas, not every murder makes the news cycle, but the ones that begin with no clear wounds, no screaming, no panic, just a woman calmly reporting a dying man, those leave a longer mark. They invite more questions than answers, and that's where this investigation stood. One dead man with a violent history, one woman with no record, no support, and a slow-burning trail of quiet instability. What was she reacting to? What triggered the turn? Those answers wouldn't come from character profiles. They would come from the physical evidence, still sitting in plastic bags, waiting to be processed. By the third day of the investigation, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department had cataloged every physical item retrieved from the crime scene and the residence. Among them was a standard white kitchen trash bag, sealed on site and labeled for forensic processing. Inside were the usual contents of a suburban household: discarded food packaging, paper towels, and used wipes. But there was one item that stood out immediately to the lab techs: a tampon wrapper, unsoiled, half unrolled, sitting atop a torn CVS receipt time-stamped at 7:43 p.m. on May 27th. This small item, though seemingly inconsequential, was flagged because of something Julie Bush herself had said at the time of her arrest. Her words were brief and disjointed, but one sentence remained consistent across her initial interview and the subsequent voluntary statement: "I saw it in the trash." That detail, unprompted, specific, and out of place, gave context to an object that would otherwise have been ignored. Forensic technicians ran standard lab work. The wrapper bore no visible blood, but DNA swabbing revealed two female contributors. One matched Julie Bush, the other did not. Chain of custody protocols were followed, and the unknown female profile was entered into CODIS. No match returned. Still, in domestic-related deaths, context can shift the weight of a neutral item. This wasn't about proving adultery. It was about establishing state of mind. Detectives revisited the home's external trash bins. Nothing further of interest was found, but the receipt that had accompanied the wrapper, an ordinary pharmacy transaction for personal hygiene items, a bottle of nail polish, and an energy drink, showed a debit card number ending in 4409. The card was not registered to Julie Bush. It was in Richard Pinardo's name. What remained unexplained was how the item ended up inside their home's trash, if, based on phone and ATM logs, Pinardo had not left the property that evening. According to his location data, verified through geofence subpoena from his smartphone, he had not moved beyond the perimeter of their front yard after 5:15 p.m. That timestamp placed him home during the purchase. The item had been brought in by someone else. Julie's phone, seized during her detainment, told part of the story. Text exchanges with Richard were minimal in the preceding 24 hours, but search history data confirmed elevated emotional agitation. Between 11 MUAS p.m. and 3 QAG a.m., Julie searched multiple variations of the phrase, "How to know if your boyfriend is lying to you." She also viewed 3 Reddit threads discussing signs of betrayal and psychological abuse. Investigators noted she did not text anyone about her concerns. She internalized them. Toxicology results for Julie returned on June 1st. The report showed the presence of fentanyl, diphenhydramine, and traces of ethanol, consistent with either recreational or numbing consumption. The levels were not high enough to suggest overdose, but present enough to cloud impulse control. In combination with forensic evidence, this pointed less toward premeditation and more toward escalation. Inside the SUV, further trace analysis revealed strands of hair embedded in the fabric lining of the driver's headrest and smeared along the passenger side dashboard. The hairs were dark blonde and not consistent with Julie's own DNA. Partial fingerprints were lifted from the inner passenger door, but lacked the clarity for matchable comparison. While these did not indicate direct foul play, they continued to reinforce the theory that someone else, specifically a female, had been inside the car at some point within 48 hours of the incident. In interviews, neighbors reported no sightings of visitors entering or leaving the home on May 27th or 28th. No surveillance cameras across the cul-de-sac recorded any third-party arrival. Either the individual had entered discreetly or, more likely, the trash item was a red herring, misunderstood or misinterpreted during an emotional spiral. But in criminal investigations, perception can carry the same psychological weight as fact. Detective Caldwell, reviewing the lab reports that night, made the following handwritten notation. No proof of affair, no proof of other woman present, but reaction tied to perception of betrayal. That's motive enough in heat of passion violence. On June 2nd, the forensic crash reconstruction report was submitted. It confirmed that the SUV had reached a speed of 36 km in the span of 2.7 seconds, from neutral to drive. No brake pressure was detected until after impact. The acceleration path matched the direct line between the driveway and the wall where Pinardo was pinned. This mattered. In voluntary vehicular manslaughter cases, state law requires prosecutors to prove the driver made a choice, even if brief, even if emotionally compromised. Julie Bush remained in custody. She did not respond to initial plea offers. She declined interviews and waived a preliminary hearing. Legal counsel requested a full psychological evaluation and withheld comments until formal arraignment. But behind the cold language of lab sheets and sworn affidavits was a silent truth. A discarded item in a trash bag became a symbol of something deeper, a relationship defined not by visible abuse or public outburst, but by tension that built quietly, invisibly, until it broke through the surface in the most irreversible way. Sometimes the clearest clues in a domestic homicide aren't bloodstains or weapon marks. They're fragments of misunderstanding, caught in the most ordinary places, like a wrapper in a trash can. On the morning of May 30th, 2024, the Clark County Coroner's Office began the autopsy of Richard Pinardo Jr. The preliminary cause of death had already been noted as blunt force trauma, but what the medical examiner needed to establish was precision, impact zones, sequence of injuries, survivability window, and whether the trauma was consistent with vehicular manslaughter or something closer to direct targeting. In forensic homicide work, margins matter. Pinardo's body arrived in stable refrigeration within 6 hours of his death. He had been pronounced deceased at 8:43 a.m. on May 29th. No external injuries were cleaned or altered prior to examination. The coroner, Dr. Lauren Kessler, oversaw the procedure. According to the full report filed on June 1st, Pinardo suffered 3 primary trauma regions: the cranial vault, upper thoracic vertebrae, T1, T4, and bilateral femoral contusions. These injuries were consistent with high-speed, head-on impact. The skull had a compound fracture on the right frontal bone, with radiating fissures extending into the orbital plate. Subdural hematoma was noted. No evidence of defensive injuries, abrasions on forearms, or signs of bracing. This suggested the victim either did not see the vehicle approaching or had no time to react. The injury pattern matched exactly with what crash reconstruction experts had reported: a velocity buildup from stationary to 36 km/h in less than 3 seconds, striking at a 0-degree angle. The force displaced the victim's body backward into a concrete wall, which caused spinal compression and internal hemorrhaging. Importantly, there was no post-impact drag. The vehicle had stopped within 3 feet of the wall, as confirmed by tire friction analysis and impact radius. Toxicology on the victim returned negative. No alcohol, opioids, or stimulants. No recent ingestion of any controlled substance. Time of death estimation matched EMS observations on scene and vitals recorded in UMC trauma. The fatal trauma occurred instantly, but death was not immediate. The report estimated a neurological death window between 10 and 30 minutes post-collision. Brainstem activity ceased within the first hour. What raised concern for the pathologist, and would later weigh heavily in legal strategy, was the sheer alignment of injuries. There was no glancing blow, no peripheral scrape. This was a full frontal trajectory, center mass alignment. The vehicle had not veered. The impact point matched the hood crease and grille emblem position of the SUV. Vehicle height was also assessed in comparison to injury elevation. The SUV in question was a 2013 Dodge Durango with a standard clearance of 8.1 inches. The femoral bruising on Pinardo's legs, located approximately 22 inches from the ground, corresponded exactly with the hood's leading edge. That data ruled out any scenario of fall, stumble, or indirect contact. Investigators had requested one additional element for evaluation: whether any part of the vehicle's bodywork, particularly the bumper, showed traces of human skin or transferred biological material. Forensic swabbing of the front end revealed microscopic dermal tissue consistent with the victim, as well as a faint partial fingerprint impression just above the license plate. It did not belong to the victim, but was too degraded for identification. As with all fatal impact cases, forensic sequencing turned to biomechanics. This wasn't just about what happened, but how fast and with how much force. Investigators brought in an independent crash scene modeler who reconstructed the SUV's path using scan lidar from the scene and vehicle black box data. That model confirmed the driver had approximately 4.5 feet of clear space on either side of Pinardo at the time of acceleration. The vehicle could have veered left or right, but did not. Steering input was minimal, consistent with a straight line. Braking occurred only 0.7 seconds after the point of contact. Taken individually, none of these details proved premeditation. But taken together, they painted a deliberate physical result. The final page of the autopsy report added a short note: manner of death, homicide, vehicular blunt force. In Clark County, the classification of homicide doesn't imply criminal intent. It defines outcome. But once that box is checked, the legal process shifts, and so does public perception. By June 4th, the case file had grown to over 300 pages. Media outlets were starting to pick up pieces of the story. Most of them focused on the initial 911 call and the strange calm in the caller's voice. But beneath the headlines, investigators were building a frame-by-frame case. Motive or not, the act had been clean, linear, and fatal. Sometimes in forensic work, what's missing becomes louder than what's present. No skid marks, no attempt to deflect, no delay in acceleration, and that absence begins to resemble choice. In towns where violence isn't expected, what makes people uneasy isn't just the crime, it's how precisely normal the moments before it looked. By early June 2024, the physical evidence had clarified how the impact occurred. Now investigators turn to why. Intent doesn't always come from a weapon. It can be hidden in a search history, in a shift in behavior, or in how someone processes pressure. That's where Julie Bush's mental health records came under review. Julie had no history of inpatient psychiatric hospitalization, but in 2021 she'd participated in a court-mandated behavioral counseling program following a CPS referral during a custody dispute unrelated to the Pinardo case. At the time, records noted heightened emotional reactivity under perceived abandonment and difficulty regulating anger in high-conflict relationships. The notes weren't legally disqualifying, but they were clinically relevant. In conjunction with her public defender, the court authorized a pretrial psychological evaluation. The session was conducted June 6, 2024, inside the Clark County Detention Center by forensic psychologist Dr. Mason Lee. The exam lasted just under 4 hours. Dr. Lee's observations, later submitted in a sealed report, pointed to evidence of chronic hypervigilance, likely stemming from long-term relational instability. Julie didn't describe voices or delusions. She wasn't psychotic. She was lucid, if guarded. When asked about the day of the incident, she offered fragmented responses, details aligned with the facts but lacking any emotional continuity. She didn't deny the crash. She acknowledged the moment, but she described it like it belonged to someone else. That detachment raised clinical flags. Still, Nevada courts do not accept emotional dysregulation alone as a legal defense for voluntary manslaughter. What they do consider is whether the defendant acted in a sudden emotional crisis, provoked by circumstances that could break the self-control of an ordinary person. The term is heat of passion, and under Nevada revised statutes, it's a key distinction between murder and manslaughter. Julie's toxicology report had already confirmed the presence of fentanyl and diphenhydramine in her bloodstream, both central nervous system depressants. While the levels weren't lethal, they were sufficient to impair cognitive processing, especially in someone with pre-existing emotional volatility. Investigators revisited her digital activity during the 36 hours before the incident. The data was linear, no signs of deletion. Between midnight and 5 a.m. on May 28th, she toggled between Google searches about cheating partners, Reddit forums on betrayal, and a private notes app where she had typed, without saving, lines that read, "I always end up invisible. Maybe this time I make them see." She never sent that note. It remained local, stored in app cache. But it added psychological context. The perceived betrayal, triggered by an ambiguous object in the trash, wasn't about what was real. It was about what felt real enough to make her snap. No eyewitnesses, no surveillance showing another woman entering the property. No confirmed affair. Yet inside Julie's mind, the scenario had taken shape and hardened. From a law enforcement perspective, this wasn't about painting a picture of mental illness. It was about assessing how far someone's internal story could spiral before they acted in a way that made it real. The district attorney's office reviewed the findings in preparation for potential charges beyond initial vehicular assault. By June 9th, the language had shifted. The phrase heat of passion was being cited in internal memos. Prosecutors weren't ready to argue premeditation, but they were preparing to show the act wasn't accidental. There's something sobering in how quickly desperation can crystallize into violence, especially when no one else is in the room. There was no moment of public rage, no threats caught on camera, just a woman, a trash bag, a search bar, and a 5,000-pound vehicle that didn't stop in time. Sometimes the most dangerous breakdowns don't announce themselves. They simmer in silence until the consequences are irreversible. By mid-June 2024, the investigation had exhausted every viable avenue of forensic discovery. Autopsy results were in. Vehicle telemetry had been verified. Digital histories, psychological evaluations, and toxicology were all reviewed, cataloged, and preserved for trial. The only question left was what to do with it. The Clark County District Attorney's Office formally charged Julie Bush with voluntary manslaughter and driving under the influence, causing death. The murder charge had been discussed internally but was ultimately set aside. The physical evidence painted a picture of a calculated act of impact. There was no erratic steering, no mechanical failure. But prosecutors recognized that what occurred was driven more by unstable emotion than pre-planned intent. Nevada law allows for plea negotiations in manslaughter cases, particularly those rooted in domestic conflict and mental health volatility. And in this case, both the DA's office and the defense team knew the risk of trial cut both ways. On one hand, prosecutors had a vehicle striking a human at full speed, a driver who didn't brake until after impact, and psychological context indicating motive. On the other hand, they lacked direct evidence of intent beyond perception. No confession, no message of warning, and no indication of an actual affair, despite Julie's claims of betrayal. The defense's strategy leaned heavily on diminished capacity without invoking full mental defect. Julie had not lost all understanding of right and wrong, but she had, according to evaluations, reached a point of emotional collapse where judgment narrowed to a fatal second. That argument, paired with the toxicology report and digital search pattern, offered enough room for negotiation. On June 13, 2024, both parties met in a pre-trial conference to propose a conditional plea. Julie would enter a guilty plea to both charges, voluntary manslaughter and DUI resulting in death. In return, the DA would agree to concurrent sentencing with a minimum term of 12 years and a maximum of 35. This plea avoided trial, spared the state a drawn-out court battle, and ensured a felony conviction with a significant custodial outcome. The judge assigned to the case, Honorable Rebecca Sandoval, reviewed the agreement. The court set a formal plea hearing for June 17th, giving both sides 3 days to confirm final statements and prepare documentation. Julie, through her public defender, accepted the plea. There was no media presence inside the courtroom that day. No family members of the victim attended. Julie Bush stood in a khaki jumpsuit, flanked by legal counsel, hands cuffed in front. When asked by the judge if she understood the charges, the penalties, and the implications of her plea, She answered only once. Yes, Your Honor. The transcript of the hearing is brief. There were no declarations of remorse, no dramatic outbursts. The moment passed like most plea hearings do, efficiently, with little ceremony. But what it accomplished was irreversible. The case transitioned from criminal investigation to sentencing, from theory to consequence. There's a clarity in plea deals that trials rarely allow. No appeals to emotion, no jury to persuade, just legal thresholds met and accountability accepted, or at least conceded. Behind the scenes, investigators submitted final case closure memos. All physical evidence was processed, all digital records archived. The chain of custody on each item, from the tampon wrapper to the SUV's event data recorder, was logged and sealed. Nothing was left incomplete. In the end, this case wasn't about proving a secret affair or dissecting every detail of a failing relationship. It was about how fast a personal crisis can transform into a public death and how the law interprets that transformation. 12 years minimum, 35 years maximum. The judge would impose formal sentencing the same day. Julie Bush would be transferred to the Florence McClure Women's Correctional Center to begin her term. She would not be eligible for parole before age 43. Some cases end with outrage, others with protest. This one ended with paperwork, a closed file, and a woman walking into a prison yard because of what happened in a split second and what she couldn't take back. On June 17, 2025, exactly 1 year and 20 days after the incident that killed Richard Pinardo Jr., the sentencing hearing was held at the Clark County District Court. The courtroom was quiet. No victim impact statements were submitted. No family member of Richard's had come forward. The prosecution did not request enhanced penalty, and the defense submitted no objections to the proposed terms. The process was brief but final. Julie Bush, 32 years old, was sentenced to serve a minimum of 12 years and a maximum of 35 for voluntary manslaughter and driving under the influence resulting in death, with both terms running concurrently. The court noted that the plea avoided a lengthy trial but did not minimize the outcome of her actions. There was no visible reaction from Julie. She didn't ask to speak. She didn't look toward the gallery. Her attorney confirmed she had no statement to give. Once the sentence was entered into the record, she was escorted out through the secured corridor that leads to detention processing. No appeals were filed. The victim's absence in the courtroom was noted only in passing, but it lingered over the proceedings. Richard Pinardo Jr. had no known next of kin willing to engage with the court. His criminal past and fragmented history likely contributed to the silence. For investigators, it reinforced what the case had represented all along: a private implosion that turned public, with no one left to speak for either side. Julie was booked into Florence McClure Women's Correctional Center later that week. Her doc profile was entered: inmate W143920, medium security classification, no prior disciplinary record, no parole eligibility until 2036. Prison intake assessments focused on baseline behavior, adaptability, mental health risk, substance dependency. Julie was flagged as low aggression, high emotional risk. Her intake paperwork noted significant internalization, meaning she wasn't likely to act out, but also unlikely to process the gravity of her actions through visible change. She was assigned to Unit 3B, a general population wing with rotating work duty and limited movement. Her daily schedule was structured: 5:30 a.m., wake up, 7 a.m. meal, 8-4 non-assigned work, 6:30 p.m. education programming, 8:30 p.m. lockdown. No special treatment, no restricted custody. The prison's psychological services offered her group counseling and individual therapy. Julie declined both at intake. According to internal logs, she later began attending group sessions twice per week but spoke rarely. One of the correctional officers assigned to the unit noted in their incident-free monthly report, "She's compliant, quiet, not confrontational, but it's like watching someone disappear over time." That observation was anecdotal but not unusual. For many inmates serving long terms without the support of family or community, institutional silence sets in early. There are no visitors, no letters, no external touch points, and over time, no expectation of either. From a criminal justice standpoint, the case was over. All procedures had been completed, all evidence secured. No loose threads remained, But from a human perspective, there's something deeply unsettling about how cleanly a life can be sentenced away, without protest, without defense, without presence. Richard Pinardo's name would not appear in future headlines. Julie Bush's name would eventually fade from databases. The case would be archived, retrievable only by docket number and court filing. But for those who worked it, from the crime scene techs to the crash reconstruction analysts to the prosecutor who had to weigh intention against opportunity, it served as a sobering reminder. The damage done in moments of emotional collapse can echo longer than anyone expects. And the absence of outrage doesn't mean a crime mattered less. It just means no one was left to yell. Julie Schofield entered the York County Prison in late November 2022 under a tightly monitored intake process. There were no media interviews, no public outbursts, and no signs of emotional breakdown. She was classified as a nonviolent offender due to the nature of her conviction, criminally negligent homicide. Yet the system made no mistake. This was not a technicality, and the consequences of her actions were irreversible. Her prison file remained uneventful in the first several months. Inmate Martyr 4329441 followed protocol, kept to herself, and did not engage in group therapy or vocational programs beyond the minimum requirements. She was neither disruptive nor participative. No calls were made. No visitors were approved. According to prison staff, she existed like a shadow, present but detached. There were no appeals filed on her behalf. Her court-appointed attorney confirmed that Julie had expressed no interest in seeking sentence reduction or parole alternatives. For all practical purposes, she had surrendered not just to the court's ruling, but to the weight of her own inaction. She had been sentenced to 3.5 to 7 years in state prison. It was not the maximum the law could offer, but it was, in this case, final. Investigators from the original case were still closing related administrative files during this period. The autopsy report remained on record. Cause of death: homicidal violence by undetermined means. The condition of the body had prevented precise conclusions. Yet surrounding facts and evidence, from phone logs to surveillance gaps to behavioral inconsistencies, left little doubt about culpability. Digital forensics had helped anchor the case. Julie's phone had been powered off at critical hours. Her movement lacked the erratic grief seen in people who discover a loved one murdered. Most damning was the lack of urgency. More than 90 minutes passed between her claim of finding Richard dead and her actual 911 call. Those details, once disjointed, had told a quiet but convincing story. Forensic psychology assessments remained sealed from the public. However, law enforcement confirmed that Julie exhibited features often found in perpetrators of passive homicide, individuals who allowed death to occur through calculated inaction. There was no psychotic break, no manic impulse, no delusion. Just an overwhelming accumulation of resentment, denial, and silence, weaponized at a fatal moment. In the final months of 2023, a correctional caseworker made note that Julie had begun attending a restorative justice circle, but only as an observer. She declined to speak. When invited to share her thoughts, she reportedly looked down and said, "I'm not sure it would matter." The facilitator noted, "She wasn't combative. She wasn't defiant. She just didn't believe redemption was possible." Richard's family had never pursued civil litigation. In public statements, his adult daughter emphasized that justice, to them, had less to do with vengeance and more to do with clarity. That we know what happened, that the lies ended. They declined further media interaction after sentencing. Their final presence in the story was in the courtroom, listening, not speaking. By early 2025, the York County Prosecutor's Office marked the case officially closed. No additional charges were pending. No accomplices were identified. The narrative, however disturbing in its psychological subtlety, had reached a point where the law could go no further. A man was dead. A woman had failed to act. And a system had responded in proportion to what it could prove. This case stood apart from others, not because of sensationalism, but because of the banality behind the crime. There were no dramatic weapons, no blood-stained crime scenes paraded in headlines. Just a quiet domestic household in southern Pennsylvania, a struggling marriage, and a woman who let her partner die and told no one. Not in time, not truthfully, and not remorsefully. The community impact lingered. In local circles, especially among professionals in social services and hospice care, the case became an example of how emotional neglect and unresolved conflict can escalate toward lethal indifference. Training programs began incorporating modules on identifying silent domestic crisis situations, not just violence, but erasure, detecting the signs when one partner begins to disappear emotionally and the other begins to let them. Julie Schofield remains incarcerated at the time of this writing. There is no public indication that she plans to speak to press, participate in any interviews, or issue statements of regret. Her release eligibility will come by 2026, assuming good behavior. Whether she re-enters society with any sense of accountability or remains in personal exile remains to be seen. The law cannot mandate remorse. Only time and conscience can attempt that. As for Richard Storm, he was cremated and buried with a quiet service held by his daughter and a few close friends. There were no headlines, no eulogies beyond private memory. But in the archives of York County's most quietly disturbing cases, his name is etched in a way that demands reflection. Not all crimes scream for attention. Some whisper. Some fade under the weight of denial until they are forced to surface. Through evidence, through absence, and through the persistent work of people who refuse to let a human life vanish without cause. As I close this story, one truth still echoes. Silence can be deadly. I've learned that ignoring tension, avoiding conflict, or bearing pain doesn't make it disappear. It only delays the damage. If you're in a relationship where the weight of unspoken resentment is growing heavier by the day, take it seriously. No one ever thinks tragedy will happen in their home until it does. What would you have done in Julie's place? Have you ever seen someone slip into silence and wished you'd said something? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Where are you watching from? And what did this story make you feel? If this video moved you or gave you something to think about, drop a comment, share your reflections, and don't forget to subscribe for more real stories that matter.